So we're talking about John Post's criticism of William Bartley's theory, at least the logical criticism and the discovery of that semantic paradox that he thinks exists at the heart of pancritical rationalism. And I think perhaps we can get bogged down a little too much sometimes in the small language of the logic here. And there's a point within this particular chapter that Bartley digs into the actual logical formalization of this. And there's no way I can put that on a podcast and make it comprehensible. It's barely comprehensible to read on the page. But I think a very clear distinction, and an obvious one, is when Bartley talks about the distinction between rational statements and the rationality of people. Post's argument, the argument he put against Bartley, as it is formulated, revolves around what it is to make a statement rational. And what makes a statement rational on Post's account is to do with the semantic property of those statements, and that they be criticizable and not produce paradoxes of the kind that he discovered. But I think this should be obvious to people reading or listening through as the podcast has gone on. Bartley is a lot less interested in that. There's a distinction here, and it's an important one. It's not a simple sidestep from what Post is putting forward. That Bartley is focusing on people. I think that's why it's such an important philosophy, pancritical rationalism. Because I think he saw, and I've said this before, I think he saw what a lot of the critical rationalists did, and particularly Karl Popper, that you could say all you like that you're making a dogmatic commitment to be undogmatic, or an irrational commitment to rationalism. But based on Bartley's background and the foil he uses for the book, which is of the reform movement within Christianity, I think Bartley understood the irrationalists better than the people around him. He understood the fodder that was being handed to them when rationalists made irrational commitments. And even if the rationalists were to turn around and say nothing ever hinges upon this, we get to the same place anyway. The door has been opened. And I think Bartley's book is a focus on the rationality of people, at least primarily, not on the logic of statements or the rationality of statements. Pancritical rationalism is not an account of rational belief, nor an account of rational statements. The real shift that pancritical rationalism offers is a shift in emphasis. That is, and in Bartley's word here, how we should tell the difference between a genuine and non-genuine rationalist. And he says this cannot be done. You cannot distinguish between a rationalist or a genuine rationalist and a non-genuine rationalist simply by looking at the beliefs they hold or the statements in which they hold and discovering if those are rational. He says statements are neither intrinsically rational or irrational. The actual rationality of a claim depends on an awful lot more. It's not just the expression of the statement, but on the historical context, the time and the place, not simply the truth of the statement itself. For example, and this is what he puts forward, if someone were to claim that the earth is flat, and they were to do so in Europe around the 12th century, this would not have made them an irrationalist. The statement is wrong, but you need to understand an awful lot more about what they know and why they're saying it and where they're saying it to understand whether they are rationalists at heart or not. Of course, rationalism is not about being right. It's about discovering error. It's about an attitude towards ourselves and the world. The rationality of any particular statement really hinges upon the way it is held and why it is held. And as Bartley says here, though he no longer believes that the Christian God exists, he is often embarrassed when he bumps into, the quote he has here, the village atheist, the one who makes that exact same claim that Bartley is doing, but does so in a dogmatic way, an irrational way. I think this is one of the bigger mistakes that hung up so many people who struggled to accept critical rationalism when it came out. That rationalism is not the same thing as truth. They're incredibly different. If you make a statement about the world, whether it's true really depends on how it corresponds with the facts of the world. But rationality is not simply a property of statements, for example, but it is a question of how those statements are held, the attitude towards those statements. Both those people, Bartley and the village atheist he bumped into, at least in his mind's eye, hold the exact same position, and let's, for example, take it to be true. But it's possible for them both to hold the truth as a statement of fact, while one being a rationalist and one being an irrationalist about it. For example, you can quite easily have a truth out there, choose whatever it may be, so truth X, and someone will say, I believe X is true, and nothing you can ever say can convince me otherwise. Well, we've already given that X is true, I'm correct, but my attitude towards X is an irrationalist one, not a rationalist one. What matters in this regard is how we approach statements, how we treat them. There is no such thing as a criteria for truth. There's no such thing as a good reason for a belief or a good reason for believing a theory to be true. All truth claims are as flat in the mud as each other. As rationalists, as critical rationalists, as pancritical rationalists, what you must do, the only thing you can do, you cannot create a criteria beforehand for which is more likely to be true. But all you can do is test and seek error and criticize. And that is the rationalist enterprise. And I think it is one of the harder things for people outside of critical rationalism, and particularly pancritical rationalism, to understand, to get their heads around. And perhaps the people, us, inside these two communities, don't give enough credit to how counterintuitive that idea can feel when it is first encountered. So let's push on then to the problem of the specification of criticism. Bartley has said here, of course, that he is not building pancritical rationalism as a theory of rationality in terms of statements and the property of those statements. And if he was, he goes on to say, it wouldn't look like Post's, or the paradox that Post developed in criticism of Bartley. We don't need to get too much into what Bartley's would look like. He doesn't offer one. He does criticize Post's and the mistakes that Post made, but we don't need to get bogged down in that. What is important here is, I'm going to read from Bartley here actually. This is a quote. He says, "What I had in mind when writing of a pancritical rationalist was of one who holds his claims open to review even when, and particularly when, he is unable to imagine, let alone specify, what could count against them." So, for the atheist, for any atheist, I'm an atheist, it's very hard to imagine what could possibly ever come around that could tell you or show you that you are wrong in your position, and that God does exist and you've been mistaken all along. The actual imagining of this, people have tried occasionally and offer things up. I don't think any of them are that convincing. But the point is this, you're open to it being possible. I don't have to formalize just what that criticism would be. I can't. And Bartley says, as a pancritical rationalist should be, that especially in those circumstances where you think it is so far beyond what is possible, or you can't possibly imagine what could ever come along, it's those moments where you must open yourself up to the possibility of being wrong and to welcome as much criticism as possible of yourself and those positions you hold. Now, Post is following Popper a little bit here, and perhaps he deserves some criticism here. And this is Popper's idea of what science should look like, good science should look like. That is, it already opens up a category of refutation. It lays down early on and beforehand, before the testing, before the theory is presented, just what a refutation of that theory would look like. This is to stop the theorist simply refusing any criticism or any refutation that comes along by ad hoc addendums. It's so much more bold, so much more honest to say from the outset, if you prove X, or if you show X, or if you successfully criticize Y, for example, then you've got me, and my theory is dead. But, of course, Bartley knows Popper better than most. And he says here that this is simply a misunderstanding of what Popper's theory actually was. Popper is, of course, talking about science, not with criticism in general. And that remark, that particular remark, which seems to have held such a central place within Popperian theory over the years, comes from a single footnote. A footnote that is trying to explain the circumstances under which an observation counts in support of a theory, not what counts or what is an account of what criticizability is for Karl Popper. Popper gives no such account, Bartley goes on to say. Popper speaks of specifying criteria in advance, a criteria of refutation, for example, not of specifying what refuting statements or counterexamples could look like or possibly could look like. You could say, for example, that if a theory were discovered to be inconsistent, or if it were to be contradicted by some empirical observation, then that would be grounds to reject it. But what you could not say, and what you could not specify, is just what those inconsistencies or that contrary evidence could be in advance, in all its detail. You could say, if this observation were contradicted by something else, sure. But the full details of what that contradiction could possibly be, well, there's not enough pages and not enough ink in the world. Now, it is a good thing, it's an honest thing to try and specify in advance what might prove a theory wrong. It does push us away from that pseudoscience that Popper was trying to reject. And it is often the case within certain scientific theories that making such predictions in advance can be possible. For example, Popper could specify, or rather, Popper could say that Einstein was able to specify in advance just what might count against relativity. Whereas, of course, famously, the Freudians and the Marxists couldn't do this. Nothing that came about was ever a refutation of their theory. Everything was encapsulated within their theory. Whereas Einstein was able to say quite openly, my theory will be proven wrong under certain circumstances. But it should be obvious from the outset here that Bartley is not focusing solely on science. And he doesn't make that hard distinction that Popper does between science and non-science. What Bartley thinks matters is criticizability. And he is interested, because of that, in a much broader range of theories and fields, including metaphysics and ethics and religion. And in these particular domains, Bartley says, there's not the slightest hope of being able to designate in advance in the way that Einstein did just what a potential criticism of them would look like. Just as I said a moment ago, the atheist would struggle to do the same thing. Just how criticism could be effective in these circumstances seems like a black hole. But Bartley says that's just the more reason for it. Just the more reason to hold these theories open to as much criticism as possible, not to designate them in advance as something beyond it. And Bartley's got one more jab at Post here. And this is one that Bartley likes to throw around as much as possible. He says Post is a justificationist. He says Post goes on to declare himself at every possible turn not to be one. But the demand in advance that you lay out every possible refutation of a theory, every potential criticizer, is in effect, as Bartley says, a demand for justification. Because if you can't do that or you don't do that, Post gets to say your theory is uncriticizable, beyond criticism, because you haven't laid out the criticisms in advance. So it's not criticizable by justification of a criteria that Post has already laid out. Bartley is beginning to get a little snarky here in his writing, and a lot of his writing can be, which is why it's so fun to read. And he talks of Post quoting Popper, or talking about Popper and how he's operating in the spirit of Karl Popper. And it says it simply reminds Bartley of Popper's statement that, and this is the quote, we never know what we are talking about. What matters and what should matter is that we criticize theories, and we can only criticize a theory in terms of how we understand it. And we only get to understand a theory by working on the theory. And you only get to work on a theory through criticizing a theory. Now, an important part of this particular process is to discover the logic involved and the relationships thereof, the problems and the evidence and the fields that matter. And this is what Popper goes on to call the problem situation. But there's no way to devise in advance or to lay it in advance just how that process is going to go. It's, as Bartley says here, a never-ending task. For example, Einstein's theory could never have been predicted when Newton's theory was put forward. It was only by working on the problem situation and working through it endlessly that new knowledge comes about and successful criticism comes about and new theories are produced. The point always is that a future theory of any kind may come along that supersedes what we have, may prove what we have false, or successfully criticize what we have. And we can never have that in advance, or by definition we would already have it. The future is open. If it weren't open, we would know it. So Bartley wants to rework Post's paradox here a little bit. Now, just for a reminder, Post's paradox was A, all positions are open to criticism, and B, A is open to criticism. And when you successfully show that B is false, you're also showing that B is true. B is false because A is not open to criticism, but B must also be true then, because A says that all positions are open to criticism. Again, I'm not going to get stuck into that again. I'm going to lose more listeners than I probably already have. But Bartley wants to rework it. And, of course, this is natural because Post is putting forward what he says is the core statement of pancritical rationalism, and Bartley thoroughly disagrees with that core statement. And this gets quite logically dense as well. What is happening here at this particular part of the appendix is that Bartley has been corresponding with Post and putting Bartley's objections to Post's objections back to him. And he says that Post acceded or agreed to most of the corrections that Bartley put forward, showing Post to be wrong. Post then sends back another series of logical statements that he believes core to pancritical rationalism, such as every rational, non-inferential statement is criticizable and has survived criticism. That is, every position which is held open to criticism and survives severe examination may be held rationally. and there's no need to go in to the question of justification. Now, these are different, and these changes are happening over time as Bartley interacts with Post, and Post rechanges his formalization. And he's reformulating this a lot because he is responding to Bartley's claim that Post is a justificationist, or he's seeking a justificationist statement, justificationist understanding of pancritical rationalism. And if you're hoping Bartley was going to offer a way out of this, his own formalization, well, no, he hasn't. And for some people that might be disappointing, but I think it's understandable. And I think the use of natural language rather than a strict logical formalization is in fact a better way to go in this. Pancritical rationalism is an emphasis and it's an attitude, I believe, much more so than it is reducible to statements themselves. But Bartley gives one thing here. He says, I was careless in the retreat to commitment, that occasionally he stated things as if they were necessary requirements or necessary conditions, and Post read them in that way. And this is where a lot of the disagreements come by. That it was Bartley's loose language at certain points that brings about Post's criticism of it. I think Bartley wants to reduce it to something else, which is simply say that his understanding of pancritical rationalism comes from his understanding of what rationalism has been in the past, the traditional accounts of it, and the comprehensive accounts of it, and then the critical rationalist account of it. And the discovery throughout that there was justificationism within it, and irrational commitments. And what he wanted to say was that you could have a non-justificationalist criticism, a criticism that was separate from authorities, and a rationalism that didn't need to make irrational commitments. And he says he has shown this, and Post's argument against him doesn't show the opposite. I mean, criticizability, after all, is not reducible to simply the possibility of falsity. What Bartley is saying is that all positions are open to criticism, and rather to show what those positions may be, he says we should leave open the possibility that they may be anything. They may be beyond us right now, beyond what we can imagine today. And yet Post's argument against Bartley, as they've gone back and forth here, seems to rest on the opposite, that you need to have a category of falsity for it to be criticizable. And without one, you can't have something that is criticizable. And this is a position that Bartley goes on to say seems to him quite obviously false and completely unreasonable. The discovery of categories of falsity, that all the possible positions of what falsity could look like, is almost certainly unachievable. And this is apart from the discovery of those paradoxes that Post is interested for an awful lot of the statements that we can hold. Perhaps it is possible in some ways to imagine certain criticisms or guess, conjecture, that the statements might be wrong in certain ways or how they may happen. But we can't imagine all of these. And simply because we have a certain position that we can't imagine any of these does not mean that there is no possible criticism. Criticism is more than simply a category of refutation. And this much seems obvious to me. It seems obvious to Bartley. And to argue the opposite really does seem slightly justificationist, or otherwise slightly dogmatic. The world is full of truths and things that we hold to be true, and things that we cannot possibly imagine to be revisable. But this is due to a lack of imagination, not to there really existing no possible way in which they could be criticized. It's a lack of knowledge. It's not a barrier, not a permanent barrier. There's nothing holding us back. It's just what we know. And the limitation that exists now is simply that we don't know enough. Well, the solution to that is to not say that criticism is not possible. Or you are, I think, in almost a cliched way, doing what Bartley wrote the book about. You're making a retreat to commitment. Okay, so we're on to John Watkins, and I'm going to make this quite quick, actually. I always say this, and it's often not, but I will, simply because a lot of Watson's arguments do overlap with Post's. But there's a slight difference, and it's perhaps a difference in emphasis here. And he says that Bartley is, and his theory is dictatorial, in the sense that any defender of pancritical rationalism is guaranteed victory in any circumstance over his critics, no matter what they put forward, because the position is never at risk. And this echoes a little bit the earlier argument that I think some people out there in the community put forward about the tentative nature of criticism and how that opens a door to defend critical rationalism. And I explained quite a while ago in this particular appendix just why I think that was wrong, but this is Bartley into it, and he puts forward the best case like this. He says, suppose a critic of pancritical rationalism produces a cogent argument showing that pancritical rationalism is not open to genuine criticism. He says this would be damaging criticism, of course. Hence, it would be impossible for a critic ever to show that pancritical rationalism is uncriticizable. Because to show that pancritical rationalism is uncriticizable is to criticize pancritical rationalism. Hence, to prove that it is criticizable after all. So it is bringing in a slightly new element there, but it also is picking up on post-distinction and post-paradox. And I'm reading Bartley now, I'm looking at the page, and I said he was scathing of Post. He's much more scathing of Watkins. He says this is a deplorable argument. He says the important thing about being a critical rationalist, if you're going to come in the school of someone like Karl Popper, is to take systems of thought as a whole, and not to cherry pick, to appraise them in the full problem situation in which they're devised, and why and how they're held. And Bartley goes on to say that in The Retreat to Commitment, and also another small book of his called Morality and Religion, this is just what he does for religion. He doesn't step back from the page and pick on a small aspect of it and say, well, it's clearly wrong. He does his absolute best to take the system of thought as a whole, to understand it and the problems it solves for the people who hold it. The whole point of what Bartley is doing here is to identify what he calls criticism deflecting strategies, those which, when brought about, immunize theories against criticism. And so let's take a little step forward here and see where Bartley's going. He says, imagine a critic of pancritical rationalism who appraises the theory as best he can in its full context, or as much context as he can find, and finds that pancritical rationalism is guilty of those immunizing strategies. All the things they just spoke about there, and all the things that Bartley wanted to kill in the book itself. And also went on to show how these things would play out in actual practice. Would the discovery of such a thing for the pancritical rationalist simply confirm to the pancritical rationalist that his position is open to criticism, and hence obviously circular and obviously dogmatic? Of course, anyone who really has such an argument, anyone who has really such an immunizing strategy, will discover all such criticisms as interpretable as confirmations of their theory. If I have the theory that the whole world is against me and it's all a secret plot, and then people come along to criticize and say, look, I quite like you, Jed, I don't have a problem with you and I can help you and all the rest, I would say, well, this is part of the plot, of course, right? This is all secret, and you would say that, wouldn't you? So that's the kind of theory that is always immunized, and no matter what criticism you put of it, simply comes across as a confirmation. And this is what Watson is saying about Bartley and pancritical rationalism. Now, could someone say this of pancritical rationalism? Really? Well, perhaps they could. That in the name of the theory itself, we could behave in such a way that no matter what you say against it, we just hold as a confirmation of it, and evidence that the theory is true and always has been. But anything, and Bartley says this here, anything can be misconstrued. And what Watson most importantly misses here is the obvious fact that there is no such thing as uncriticizability in general, or uncriticizability in a vacuum, as it were. Any system that is uncriticizable is only uncriticizable in certain specific respects, not uncriticizable in general, nor is it ever completely uncriticizable even within those vacuums. Any theory that has a deflecting strategy or an immunizing strategy is something that we can identify within the theory itself. And a beginning way to criticize is to begin to criticize the existence of those factors, which of course makes them criticizable. Bartley is a little apoplectic here, that Watson is not seeing this, that an immunizing strategy against criticism does not make a theory uncriticizable, at least in principle. The idea that pancritical rationalism is uncriticizable, for a start, I don't think is true. But even if it were making all those mistakes that all the rationalists were, it doesn't make it uncriticizable, neither in the smallest degree or the largest. There is always a way in. The issue here, of course, is not whether the criticisms exist or whether they already exist. It's rather whether criticisms can exist, and when they do exist, be used in a way that transforms the theory that holds it. Because, of course, Watson is saying here that pancritical rationalism is beyond transformation. The problem is that any system, and this is Bartley speaking here, any system that followed the work of Watson, or what Watson suggests here, that is, using criticism as evidence of criticizability, at the expense of not taking criticism seriously, well, you could obviously see the mistake that they're making. The system would never transform and never change. But pancritical rationalism is not this. It seeks optimate criticism. It's always trying to optimize what is possible and what is criticizable, and therefore what is transformable. It's not addicted to the idea of criticizability. It wants criticism because it wants change. It wants the removal of error. What Bartley says Watson is doing here is juggling two words, rational and criticizable, and simply ignoring the system itself and what the system seeks to do. Again, getting himself stuck in a semantic paradox. And this brings us to some of the other problems with Watson's account, which is when Watson talks about things need to be obviously uncriticizable or obviously criticizable. This, I think, is the problem, and I'm surprised Watson has it here, which is, I think, a failure to understand what critical rationalism is, and I went through this quite a while ago. In short, Bartley goes on to say here that every example Watson puts forward of this kind becomes quickly irrelevant, because his examples are dogmas, they're justifiers, and they're never doing the problem or the work of understanding the problem situation or pancritical rationalism and getting simply stuck within the word games themselves. Watson believes that things can be obviously true and obviously criticizable, and we don't need to attach ourselves to the tentative aspect of them. His particular example of this is, and I'll quote, "There exists at least one sentence written in English prior to 1980 that consists of precisely 19 words." Watson goes on to say that this, as an example, is certainly true and henceforth uncriticizable because it is so certainly true. But what Bartley wants to say is that it is still criticizable and it's still revisable in that sense of the word. And it might be revised. In fact, Watson engineered the sentence in that way because it was exactly 19 words long and presented it as my 19-word, obviously true statement. And Bartley says from the outset, what about the obvious thought that instead of 1980 being 2 words, there was a hyphen in the middle, and 1980 was 1 word, making even that an 18-word sentence? The point is not to be definitive here, and of course Bartley's point is quite glib and rather shallow as well, but he acknowledges this. What he's trying to say is that it doesn't take much effort to begin to imagine criticism. The most obviously true claims about ourselves, or obviously true claims about anything, are never really that obviously true. They just appear so. There's always a potential criticism. The point is, we're looking for real criticism that would change things. And simply because none exist does not mean, and this is a logical principle, that none can exist, or none will exist. The pancritical rationalist simply holds open the possibility that they could be wrong. And with that said, we're almost at the end of this series on Bartley. There's only 2 appendices left, both are fairly short, and I'll add a very last episode bringing forth some of the critics of Bartley in very short thrift that Bartley, of course, never got around to replying to during his life. He died quite young. So I think I have 4 in mind, and then I think there's a few details that I might add at the end just for the importance of Bartley. But that episode will be short too. I'll keep those criticisms quite brief, simply to guide people towards them if they think they're interesting. But on that, that's the end of Appendix 4. And I'll see you soon for Appendix 5.